Okay, so good afternoon, everybody. Today I'm going to speak about rock art documentation. I put in the title of this presentation in cave context, but actually I'm going to speak in different contexts, not only the cave, in cave context regarding a project that we have been working in the past 2 years, but also documentation in open air sites, some examples. Because when we speak about rock art documentation, we cannot speak about only one method. There is no like a closed protocol to deal with rock art sites. There is a set of methodologies that we can use. Some of them are considered good practices, and some of them are considered that used to be considered good practices, but today we know that can be damaged for the panels or for the shelters, so we don't use it anymore. And some of them, we only use them in one specific technique and not in another one, okay? For example, when we use plastics to do the tracings of engravings, we can still do it depending on the situation in engravings, but for example, we cannot use them in paintings anymore. But it is something that it was used for a long time until some years ago. So when we are speaking about rock art documentation, probably if you look for in the bibliography, you will find a lot of different methods. And lately, especially using a lot of the new technologies like 3D, or D-Stretch, or a lot of applications to different types of 3D. That's quite common in the bibliography these days. So but we still don't have like a closed protocol, like you have to do this, and that's it. That doesn't exist. Why? Because each site is a little different from others. So each site is unique, and many times we have time restrictions or access restrictions or material or resources restrictions. So I normally say that each case is one case, and depending on your resources, on your budget, on your time, there are things that are okay to use and other things that it's not that okay to use. But normally it's a kind of methodology that we have to study the site in advance to know more or less how to do the best practice in rock art documentation of the site. So today I'm gonna present 3 or 4 study cases that we use more or less the same methodology, but with small differences between the sites, okay? So the first big project that I'm gonna speak about today, it is the one that we have been working for the past 2 years, that it's called the First Art Project. And it's about, it started, right now we are in the second phase of the project, that it's more focused on archaeometry analysis of pigments and datations. But the first part of this project was focused on 2 caves, the Scoral Cave in Portugal and the Maltravieso Cave in Spain. So these are the 2 caves that have Paleolithic rock art, and they are in the Iberian Peninsula southwest. So in the southwest of Iberian Peninsula, there are only 2 caves with Paleolithic rock art, which is this one, not far away from each other, even if they are in different countries, but Maltravieso, it's really close to the border of Portugal. And the First Art Project started with some goals, because both of the caves are quite near each other. Like I said, they have very similar history of discovery. They are very similar in geographic context, geological context, in the history of research. Even if the rock art that each one presents, it's a little different. Scoral Cave has a lot of animal paintings and engravings and a lot of geometric figures. And Maltravieso Cave is known for the hand stencils that presents the majority of the rock art there presented. There are also animals, but they are just a few. And Maltravieso Cave is also known, or became a little bit more famous, because some years ago in 2018, there was a program of datation of rock art with uranothorium, whereas Maltravieso was one of the caves that presented some really old datations for some of the hand stencils that the cave has. So because of this initial work, there was a project that was put for a European program led by Professor Hipólito Collado. And among the objectives of the project was, because these two caves, in spite of having a lot of rock art, and they were known, or they are known since the 60s, the 50s and the 60s from the 20th century, actually both caves had never had a complete corpuses of the paintings and engravings. There had been in the past a lot of studies in both caves, but there was lack of a complete corpuses of the cave. There was lack of recent research on caves using technology, using the stretch, using 3D. So the last studies in both caves had been a long time ago, more or less 20 years. So this was a very good opportunity, not only to make the analytical studies on both caves again, one to confirm or not the old datations that we had, and the other two, especially in Scoral, that had never had this kind of there was some trials of datations with the other study groups, but there was no results yet. So the project focused not only in systematically review and complete a catalog of all the paintings and engravings, but also to make a complete set of analytic studies, the composition and of the pigments, first absolute datings, and to do a very complete set of not only the documentation, but methods of archaeometric analysis in both caves. This is something that will be focused on the next lecture. I'll focus on the part that how we did the documentation of the caves. In this case, when the project started, Maltravieso Cave already had a lot of the catalog ready, because there's a team, the same team that put the first art project, Hipólito Collado, already started the catalog in Maltravieso, so it was already in advance. But in Squirrel Cave, we had to start by scratch. And starting by scratch doesn't mean that it's going to be more difficult, because the first step before we went to the cave was actually to see all the old studies. So who had been working in Squirrel since it was discovered in 1963. And a lot of the studies were very helpful, especially because there was already a map of the cave with most of the paintings and engravings that existed there. So there was already a sort of more or less a good knowledge of what was going on in the cave, even that until today we didn't have a complete catalog of the cave. So with local archaeologists that were also part of the first art project, the first step was to see all the first studies of the cave in advance, of course, and be prepared with the location of the already known panels existed in the cave. So where were the panels? If there was a specific way that archaeologists put the numbers on the panels. And in this case, for example, there was this very complete publication in 1995 that was done about Squirrel Cave that had the map of the cave with the location of paintings and engravings. In this case, our colleagues put what was the paintings in red and what was engravings in green, which was obviously very helpful for us. So our first step in this project was to make the prospection of this cave. There was already also first a preliminary 3D. Along some years ago, we know that there was a company that did a 3D of the entire cave. And the idea was to make it a public resource for researchers or for visitors that cannot go inside the cave, because the cave obviously has a lot of visitation restrictions, and it's possible to visit the cave, but small groups, only a restricted amount of people can go every day in specific hours, and you cannot see the entire cave. There's only a small part of the cave that is visible. Normal restrictions that nowadays researchers put in caves. But this 3D was really, really heavy. It was not made in a way that could be made public in an easy way. So it was used only for more graphic illustration of the cave than for a virtual trip on the cave, for example. In any case, these drawings and these graphic illustrations were very helpful also to understand more or less where paintings and engravings were. And as you can see, some of them are under this wooden structure that was built for the visitations. So that means there are parts that visitors cannot see, but there are important panels in those areas. We started the prospection of the cave with the students from the master that was part of the team. And the first days was literally to go and check all the single paintings and engravings that were already marked in our map, confirm exactly what was there, and also see around those panels, check around those panels if there was more engravings and more paintings. And I can say in advance that we found more engravings and more paintings, which was mainly more engravings, which was very interesting. And that means that all rock art sites, normally this happens. When you think that we did a very unique and detailed work, probably there was something that someone will find it later because there's a specific light position or something was missing. And to see rock art, we depend a lot on light. And in caves, obviously, there are a lot of like a light game inside the cave. So because we can see something in a very specific light position, and maybe if you just turn it 5-10 degrees, you won't see it. So it's quite easy to miss a lot of things. So in this case, the first part of the project was the prospection for confirming all the figures that were already known, the numeration, the numbers that were set for each of the panels, and everything new that we were finding to also include in this first catalogation. This cave is very interesting. It's not a big cave, but there's a lot of panels with both paintings and engravings. And the engravings are also animals and geometric figures. So, and because it has been so many years that there was not a big project devoted to the rock art of the cave, even if for the excavations there has always been projects along the time, and there are still colleagues working on the cave in the archaeological contexts and excavating the contexts. For the rock art, it was very interesting to have the opportunity to go back and actually make everything from scratch. So we used photography for the prospection, the forms to actually start a preliminary characterization of each panel, to use the numbers that were already new from the maps and the first studies that other colleagues had done. And this was very important. Why? Because first we were making sure that everything that was known was there and we could confirm, and then we were finding more. And in this first part of the prospection, we are not making like new numbers, where we were adding the numbers next to the ones that we already know of the panels. For the second phase of the documentation itself, we could actually start numbering by a new combination that actually could make sense in the final report. Okay, so in this case, we were marking each panel by photography. Obviously, in this case, especially, well, in rock art, generally speaking, and especially in cave context, it's absolutely forbidden to touch the panels and to make any kind of impact on the panels. So everything was marked using the map that we already had, using photography, using a lot of documentation, but with absolutely no direct impact on the panels. A very important part of this is obviously to have everything well recorded, well documented. Why? Because we divided the work in the cave in different groups of work. There was one group of the prospection that entered the cave, check all the panels, check all the walls, and later there were two other teams that came at the same time, along with the team of archaeometrical analysis that had to work more or less at the same time, but according to the preliminary prospection that we did. So when the documentation team came, everything had to be already very clear. Where were the panels? What was the rock art that was there? What were we expecting to see? If there was paintings or engravings or both. And this is also very important because documenting paintings, you need a certain kind of light, but documenting engravings, you need different kind of lights, more lights in very specific positions, so we can see it later when we are doing the digital tracing. Regarding engravings, it's much more difficult work in the digital tracing than paintings. So when the documentation team comes, everything already has to be very, very clear and well organized, so we don't waste time, we don't waste resources, and we know that everything is going to be done in the correct way. One of the forms, this is an example of one of the forms that we used. Each panel that we were cataloging and the final list that I will show you, in the end, we had 92 panels. So for a small cave like Squirrel, that is considered small, it's actually a lot of panels. Each one of the panels had been recorded in different ways. One of the ways is the filling of this form that not only give us information about the location of the cave itself, what kind of site it is, but the number of the panel, measurements of the panel, description of the paintings or engravings, and obviously small observations that will be very useful in the future. For example, when we have such a small space like a cave, it's easier for us to have exactly the position of one panel and say the next panel is 30, 40, or 50 centimeters left from the previous panel. So this kind of small notes that actually make a lot of difference and make it very easy if we have to go back many times to make sure that we know exactly where things are and make all the work very smooth. In this case, we can also make some sketches on the field. This is not a form like the final report form. This is on the field with notes made by hand, with different measurements, with different observations. So this is a very personal way of doing one of these forms. There's a standard document that in this case for this project we had this one, but it doesn't mean that it has to be this one. So normally we can create any other standard documentation. The important part is that from the form we can actually have access to a lot of information, even if only for me or for you will make sense in that time, but then we can create a standard form in the lab, put all the information together. But on the field, it's very important that we can actually write down everything that we think is very important. And something that this form doesn't say, this is example actually doesn't have, but for example, I normally put observations for the photographic record. What does this mean? If we spend one entire day in a cave or in a shelter taking thousands of pictures, that literally is thousands of pictures, and especially if we have more than one team shooting at the same time, it's very important that the person that is dealing with the records, the written records of what's going on, should from one panel to another write down which pictures are concerning a specific panel. So normally we put after we make the photograph of one panel, we write down what are the numbers of the pictures regarding that panel. Because after in the lab, it's going to be very helpful to actually organize the photographs of a specific panel, especially if they have details or if the details or the engravings, for example, are very hard to see, okay? Another example that we used for the prospection part and even for the documentation part, this is something that I normally do with the phone. It's just a very light record, but it's actually very handy, is to make small photographic maps. I call it photographic maps. That, well, it's the invented word. So I take if we have a lot of panels in the same area, for example, this part here, we had a lot of different panels in a very small area. It's very handy if we use something very simple as our phone to actually make a picture and write down what we are seeing and what we want to remember after. So, for example, in the panel 54, it was a big panel with different small sectors. So the panel was very big, and then I divided by small sectors. And everything was engravings. So from the picture, it was almost impossible to see what that was. Only in the detailed picture, that's why we take sometimes hundreds of pictures of only one panel, because after, in using, for example, Photoshop, we can overlap pictures and see a lot of things, but we need a lot of different light positions in one picture. In this case, it is very helpful if I make one picture and tell exactly what I want to see, where I should be looking for that specific engraving. So this is a very easy way of doing these small maps, but actually they are very helpful then in the lab to actually help to organize all the panels, reminding that it was almost 100 panels. So imagine that I have 300 or 400 pictures for each panel, which I probably do, including the 3D of that panel. We are talking about thousands of pictures. And 100 panels in a cave can be very difficult to remember and to localize in the map. So everything that we can actually add to organization and knowing exactly where we are, it helps a lot. This is another example. And then obviously inside the cave, we have different galleries, sectors inside the cave that normally archaeologists call it galleries. Panels are in completely different sites from one cave. So as more accurate with small notes that we can be, it's actually quite helpful. So this is just an example of something that we were using that helps a lot in the end in the lab. And then the documentation per se. So as you saw until now, it was the prospection, preparing all the material for the documentation teams. When I call documentation teams, what does that mean? Because we are already doing a lot of recording and documentation before, but it was just to help with the position of the panels, what could we expect from each panel, and to help the teams that come after that will actually make all the photographic records to help very much faster and accurate. In this case, we had two teams working at the same time. So even if the cave was not very big, we had some time restrictions in the sense that we had to put a team together, quite a large team together in short days. So what we decided was that team number one would start making the photographic record from the beginning to the cave to the middle, and team number two would start in the back part of the cave, starting to make the photograph record until the middle of the cave. And the person that is responsible for the prospection that was done in advance has to be coordinating both teams, exactly pointing out where are the panels, what is the number of the panel, what we have there, especially in engravings that it's quite difficult to see. And then there are specific ways also of making the photographic record. It's not just take 2 or 3 pictures and that's it. We need a photograph of the panel. We need a photograph of the details of the paintings or engravings. Engravings must have several types of photographics with different light positions that will help us in the lab work after. We have to be aware of using a scale. We have to be aware of using a color checker scale, which is specific for the color control, equilibrium of the color control of the panel. So there's half a dozen of procedures that are very important for each panel. So this is the part where we can actually call it like a protocol, because there's a list of things that all the panels have to be we have to do for each one of the panels. Okay. Sorry. So most of our days was this protocol that were applied to all the panels. Obviously, in between, and because there are more experts in the cave, we actually found more panels, more rock art, more paintings, and more engravings specifically, because there were some other different types of lights and light systems that were being used for photography. And with those new lights, we were able to see more engravings. So everything was extremely good. And in the end, we end up with a set of 92 panels, which are amazing for the type of cave that this coral cave is. And one of the tools, I think I can call it a tool, one of the tools that most help rock art researchers these days, it's something called D-Stretch. Probably most of you already heard about D-Stretch. It's a small plugin for this image controlling small software, image. It's like a small Photoshop image J that we can add this plugin, D-Stretch, and this is the website that you should go look for more information about this plugin. And what does this plugin makes? If you have original photo of anything, and this works mainly for paintings, okay, this was made for paintings, even if we can see the shape of the painting in a panel, even if we actually cannot see it there or see it in difficulty, what this stretch makes is enhancing all the colors or the pigments that are on the panels. So this is one example from Maltravieso Cave. That is a hand stencil. The picture from the left, it's actually the original the original picture of this hand stencil. It's a very difficult figure to understand. Okay, it's a hand stencil, but it's quite difficult. Normally, you need a lot of experience to actually see a hand stencil and know the shape of this figure. But what this stretch makes it to enhances all the pigment around and help us to see much better all the shapes of the figure. And in this can be, how is this stretch helpful? You can say, oh, now I can see it very well. Exactly. But this can be used in two different ways. This stretch can be used in the prospection, okay, using it to try to find more paintings that are completely gone, or you think it's gone because you can actually not see it with your eyes, but this stretch can enhances the remains of the pigment that are there. So sometimes even things that are very faded or that you cannot actually see anything, this stretch show us that has been a painting there, okay? And this stretch is also very useful for the document, the part that we do digital documentation. So in the lab, using other softwares like Photoshop, this stretch can actually help us to enhance all these paintings. And from the image that we create with this stretch, we can actually work to take the shape of the figure from the panel. This is another example of a panel in Squirrel Cave. It's not a bad panel. Actually, this panel, it depends how humid the cave is. We can see it better or not. If the cave is really, really dry, this horse almost fades, disappears from the panel. In this case, we can actually see some of the shape of this animal, but obviously with this stretch, we can actually see much more details, okay? So this stretch can be very helpful for the prospection to find new paintings, but also for the documentation part in the lab after. Another good news is that regarding the engravings, we were able to find some new panels that we didn't know before. One of the examples, it's this very faded bovine figure that is under a very thick layer of calcite. And it was found by chance. We were looking at one panel and talking about one panel, but because we were moving the lights in a very specific way to talk about this panel, we actually saw a bovine on the next panel. So obviously this is a teamwork, and many times regarding engravings, it has a lot to do with lights. So this was a news for the cave. And another one was that there was one big panel that was already known for having a lot of animal figures, but in this prospection and in this documentation work, we actually found a new species that has never been found in the cave. We found a goat figure that was the first time that actually was presented. So besides the work that I talked so far, so we are talking about panel by panel, the registration of parts of the cave one by one, panel by panel. We also did a lot of work regarding the 3D of the entire cave. So within the project, there was companies that do 3D scanner that were hired to make the 3D of the entire caves, both Squirrel and Maltravieso. And why is it important? It is important because from here we can do a lot of things, not only from the scientific point of view, but also from the dissemination point of view. But in this case, these 3Ds were to transform into dissemination and virtual visits for both caves. So in the case of Maltravieso, it's quite especially important because Maltravieso cave, the real one, is closed for the public. It is a very controlled cave. It has a very delicate conservation state, and now it's closed, and it's already, because of this new 3D of the entire cave, money is being raised by public institutions to create the replica of the entire cave for the public. In the case of Squirrel, the original cave is opened, And the conservation state is not that as bad as Motravieso, okay? So far, it's quite stable, I think, even if it has controlled visitations. But for example, many people cannot have access to the cave, especially the people that is impossible to enter that cave. So the replica of the entire cave, it's very useful, not only to save the cave of unnecessary visitations, okay, even for scientific purposes, because anybody else that wants to study the cave or have access to the panels can do it without actually have an impact on the cave itself, but especially for dissemination purposes, for exhibitions, for virtual visitations. Well, the opportunities there's a lot of opportunities here. This is the cloud point of Squirrel Cave that started to be done. And another good point of doing the entire 3D of the cave using new technologies was that we were able to create a new plant of the cave, much more accurate than the one that we had previously. This one already had incorporated the wooden path that was made for the visitations, and the old plant didn't have it. And it's very funny because there are some panels that are today under the wooden panel that today they are there. But from example, from the first map, it's impossible to know because the wooden path, it's not there. So it looks like the paintings are there, but they are not. They are hidden. So this map, it's actually quite more accurate and help us to understand much more the dynamic of the position of the paintings and engravings in the cave. Also, besides all the work that we did photographing one panel one by one, we also did for each one of the panels 3D photogrammetry. And this is very important, especially for the panels that have engravings, because engravings are quite hard to see on those panels. This will be very helpful, especially for scientific and dissemination purposes, because there were, even in a normal visitation inside the cave, it's very hard for the guide to show, for example, to visitors, where are the engravings, how they can actually see it without touching, what do they mean, what is the shape of the engravings. I visited the cave before this project many times, and I know there are engravings, but I'm pretty sure that most of the visitors didn't see it or didn't understand when we are talking about engravings inside the cave. And actually we can see beautiful animals within the cave, but they are made in such a very thin technique that only with drawings or the 3D photogrammetry are able to see it properly. And even using photogrammetry, we are talking here about a very high quality 3D, okay? Because the techniques that they draw these animals are quite thin. It's not a low quality or a middle quality 3D that make us actually see what's there. So all the panels were photographed in a very high quality to create high quality 3Ds also, to make it as much more available as possible. This is an example in raw vision still, the virtual trip that we can actually provide for the public or for exhibitions in the near future. So it's actually quite exciting because right now, if you go and visit the real cave, you will have a very strict access to the cave. You will see just half a dozen of panels. And with a virtual visit, doing absolutely no impact on the cave, you can actually have access to all the cave. And which is very exciting, not only in the scientific point of view, but for the public point of view, to know more about this resource without actually thinking about the conservation issues of mass visitation of the cave, even because this cave is quite problematic in the sense that there's a lot of archaeological context still there intact, and there was a lot of burials from early Neolithic. So there's still a lot of bones, human bones, spread on the cave. There are a lot of contexts that are untouched. So it's very problematic in that sense as well. It's not a cave that actually can be easily visitable. Okay, so in the end, we end up reorganizing the numbers of the panels, okay, with all the panels that we found, the new ones, the ones that we already know. Some of the panels we were also able to see that it's not only paintings that are there, but also engravings, which is new information. So in the end, we end up with 92 panels for Squirrel Cave. And the typology of figures, it's mainly animal figures and geometric figures. And the second part of documenting rock art is how do we treat all this material in the lab after? And obviously there's a big amount of ways, the different methodologies we can actually use. But for the panels itself, one of the methodologies that we can actually use is using Photoshop, making different layers of the many pictures that we did with different lights. This, for example, for engravings, it's very important, and actually make the digital drawing on the top. So there's a lot of hours, focus hours, to actually understand what is engraved there, what is the shape. We have to actually respect the size of the tracing, of exactly try to replicate the shape and the digital movements, not the real movements of the person that actually did that engraving, but to try to respect a lot of the shapes that we are actually seeing, which is not very easy. Also, we have to consider the scale of the panel. Okay, this is also very important because our final representation has to have always into account the not only the shape but the size of the panel. And then from having the basic part done, the drawings done, we can actually present it in many ways that we want, for whatever we want. And these are different ways that we can actually present it. If it's for a scientific paper or a book or a thesis or an exhibition, doing the base work, digitally speaking, we can actually then present it in many different ways. These are only some examples of the tracings that we are doing right now. The tracing of the entire cave is being done as we speak. So these are some of the examples that we have both in paintings and engravings. In paintings, we have, there are difficulties in different techniques. Engravings normally are very hard to see. Paintings, we have to work a lot with extracting the pigment that is making the figure itself, and not the rest of the pigment or different colors of the wall. So, and obviously this difficulty is much higher in panels that we have both paintings and engravings. So it's like using a lot of different techniques in one panel. This is an example of a panel that has different colors. There's the back part of a horse in black, then you have red lines on the top, there are different pictures. So we also have to be aware of different figures and try to understand it one by one, and what is the dynamic of the panel itself. And for example, I'm pretty sure, I didn't finish this panel yet, but I'm pretty sure there are engravings on the top. So after working on the paintings, I'm going to have to apply some different techniques for drawing the engravings. And another thing that we can do, either we work with the 2D, two-dimension pictures that we took, or we work with the 3-dimension pictures that we do. So we can actually apply this stretch to the 3D model and work from there, especially if the panel is really big, as in this case. I don't know if you can understand from the D-stretch model here, we have some black horses paintings of black horses impiled one in another. So it's a very big panel, and it wouldn't be as accurate if we put it in only one picture, one photograph. So doing a 3D, high quality 3D of the entire panel helps us a lot to understand not only exactly where the paintings are, but also the dynamic regarding the shape of the panel. And that in caves is very important. And many times it actually impacts the interpretation that we do of the panels, the shape of the panels itself. And also a big part of this project was because we used a lot of this work also to understand the conservation issues of the paintings and engravings. And we implemented a new monitoring system of the environment of this cave. This is very important in long terms to understand how the conservation of the cave is going, if it's actually creating, if it's a bad conservation, it's creating issues, how is the impact of the visitors in the cave, if it's enough what is being done so far or not, do we have to change the management plan of the visitations. So implementing a new system for monitoring the environment of the cave, it's going to be very important to actually compare the state of the conservation of paintings and engravings now with this data in the near future. And in the end, just to say that documenting rock art, in this case, and it's mostly the cases that we have been working the last few years, it's not just making the registration, the documentation forms and pictures and 3Ds of a site. It also involves taking samples of paintings, taking samples of the pigment, and trying to make datations of the engravings and paintings. So it's like a multi-proxy interdisciplinary action. It's like a multi-proxy protocol using documentation, but also trying to know a little bit more about the paintings and engravings through analysis, which is going to be the next lecture. And in the case of Scoral specifically, we did this. It was a very big set of actions that actually is going to help us to understand much more this cave in the future. Very quick, because I thought it would be earlier. Very quick, I think I have 10 minutes. This was a context of a cave, okay? I just want to say that there are many different contexts regarding rock art. For example, we already had the opportunity to work in a very big dolmen de Soto in Trigueiros, that had 74, if I'm not mistaken, standing stones with both paintings and engravings. And in this case, it's also a very unique and fragile environment, so we couldn't actually touch anything, not even engravings. So there was a similar protocol that was implemented in this site, especially regarding the light systems and the way we put the lights and taking the photographs, so we can actually do the drawings and the tracings in the lab after. But some of the cases that we worked actually had also paintings on the top. In this case are engravings, then we can actually enhance some of the figures. But for example, in this standing stone, we had engravings and we had paintings. So the documentation of these standing stones specifically, we had to apply different methodologies, the D-stretch for the paintings, different light systems for engravings. So it's not, like I said in the beginning, there is not one protocol for working in rock art. Each site is going to be a different way of approaching, and we have to be aware of how to deal with different techniques. In this case, there was a lot of different types of engravings as well. I think Dolmen de Soto had all the techniques that I can see in the rock art. Paintings, engravings. Inside engravings, there were scratching, abrasion, packing. It's a very rich site to work on everything that rock art can present itself. And just to finish, an example that we worked in Brazil a couple of years ago, a completely different situation, in this case, open air sites, engravings open air sites, with quite big rocks. When I say big, the person here is making as a scale, gigantic rocks only with engravings. And in this case, everything has to be adapted to the different situations. Depends on the resources you have. In this case, we had a chance to work with professional photographers, with drones. We had the opportunity to do an excavation. At the same time, the restrictions were about time and the temperatures. It's an open air site, and in this field work there was during the day 40-50 degrees in some days, so it was quite difficult to work. And taking into account there are engravings in the open air, we were very actually dependent on the sunlight. And in the middle of the forest, that's not very good, because you're gonna always end up with the problems with the shades. Some things you will see, some things will not see. In this case, we decided to make a mixture of different methodologies, using the drones for high altitude pictures and for high altitude 3Ds of the entire rocks. We decided to use the plastic tracings as well, because this is an example of what was happening. We were expecting to have an optimum light in very specific time of the day, but we were having problems with the shades, of course, because we were in the middle of the woods. And the second rock, there was two rocks that we were working. The second rock was just too big, and the engravings were spread along the surface. So deciding on a mixture of techniques was using almost old school plastic tracings. In this case, it's engravings. The impact is minimum. If it was paintings, we cannot use this, okay? But engravings, we can actually still use depending on the site. Dividing the rocks by sectors, and then making a protocol of different photographies, not on the only in the surface of the rock, but also using the drones and using 3D photogrammetry. And in this case, making a lot of sketches and topographic drawings of the rock itself, where the different sectors of engravings were, and then making the same position for the plastics, that we can actually then compile the information using, for example, Photoshop in the lab. Putting all this information together, we can actually position the figures in the right place of the rocks, okay? Some examples of the plastic tracings that we were doing at night, because during the day it was so hot that we would melt the plastic. So we were working at night on the tracings itself, and then during the day doing the drone photography, the 3Ds, everything that the topography drawings as well, and the excavation. And then in the lab, it's easier to compile and put as a layer, like a stratigraphic layer of data, that will make us understand exactly where the position of the plastics were on the 3D, on the photographies, the photos of each one of the sectors of the rocks, and working from here. The idea would be to actually have a final comprehension of the distribution of the engravings, the typology, the shape of the engravings, how many figures we had, exactly how they were spread on the rock. This is the final goal, to have the final drawing of the rock itself, or the both rocks in this case. So in this case, this was an emergency work that would be also used after for the protection of the site itself, and using the material not only for scientific purposes, but also for dissemination purposes, and to put in panels on the site. They protected the site after, and they used these drawings and all the material that we provided for the information panels of the site after. I think we are done. Thank you very much for your for paying attention.
Thank you very much, Sara.